Paar secund. Okay, ready, go.
Okay, so today we're discussing the third chapter of the book, in which Canguilhem compares the concepts of norm and average. So first he asks, of course, what is a norm, and tries to, in this biometric fashion, establish that it's just an average of a certain population. And of course, when he asks where this comes from, he realizes that actually Bernard was opposed to this simple numerical average, because he maintained that it erased the oscillatory and rhythmic character of biological functions. So one needed to determine exact experimental conditions to be epistemologically capable of distinguishing between ideal type and the divergences from it. But essentially, norm is here established. Now, of course, where does the concept of average come in? With Ventry, who actually says, okay, what if the organism itself that regulates this determined condition or determined conditions that were with Claude Bernard relegated to the experimenter? By developing, of course, he accomplishes this by developing the Bernard's concept of internal environment, and adding to it the concept of physiological regulation in order to accomplish this kind of regulation of the complex of functions, which nevertheless withstand chance. Therefore, norm is not just any kind of average, but an individual average. But of course, a certain problem of individuality arises. Namely, one never follows the individual throughout his life. So it's very complicated to determine what his or her average is. There are two options, of course. One is that the one that evaluates a certain test as a doctor and thus qualified to diagnose diseases. He thus possesses a certain practical know-how with which he reacts to a call of the patient. And since this call of the patient is, of course, very qualitative, this cannot be, we cannot establish a complete scientificity of average, because its qualitative modes invades. The second option, of course, is to use statistical inference. And that's exactly what contemporary biometrics in his time did. Namely, they equated norm and average. As said, it could be said that they employed kind of a positivist ignorance, where they tried to forget all the practical know-how and establish knowledge before this action that was established before, that was kind of habitual therapeutics. Of course, once more, the individuals are really the problem, because in order to accomplish this statistical calculation of a norm, individuals have to conform to a certain norm, namely they are normal. But at the same time, insofar as the individuals, they diverge from the norm in their own special ways. So each individual is also abnormal. Therefore, an individual specific difference is both normal and abnormal at the same time. So we are faced with this arbitrary practical specification of the normal divergence, or one could also say abnormal conformity. And of course, here once more, the quality comes in. The judgment is not quantitative. So what if we reverse? What if we base average in a certain understanding, ontological probably, and then social also, of a norm, so that average, as we'll see, expresses a norm. And Quelet is the first one who does this. Namely, with the certain statistical approaches, we can determine an average, which shows us a regularity, which expresses a divine norm that is given to each organism. But of course, very soon one can see that the independence of measured values, which is crucial for statistical approaches, is actually impossible. This is especially obvious in the interaction between social and vital norms and milieus, since by looking for an average height or average lifespan, we see that it's not dependent on some kind of divine norm, but rather kind of life. So the lifespan of people working in on a construction site is going to be different from those working in offices. But this concept, we should pay attention, nevertheless, to this concept of expression, which Canguilhem takes for his own. But he does another he steps forward and says, okay, we should not define norms in terms of populations, but rather in terms of individual norms. The individuality of organisms here comes through. And what then is average? He says that it is just the unstable equilibrium of nearly equal norms and forms of life temporarily brought together. We have seen this with the example of butterfly in the previous chapter. But of course, how does the organism accomplish this norm? How come that organism, nevertheless, in a certain environment, converge to a certain average? He calls this, Canguilhem calls this process normalization, in which the organic tendencies, environmental tasks and resources, and in case of human beings, also social norms, are taken into account in order to construct this norm, which is very specific to the environment within which it was constructed. He says that a normal specific form would be the product of a normalization between functions and organs whose synthetic harmony is obtained in defined conditions and is not given. So there is a certain creative act present in this establishment of new norms. But he goes even further. He says, no, there is a kind of sub-individuality of norms. Since if we can speak of normal man as determined by the physiologist, it is also because normative men exist for whom it is normal to break norms and establish new ones. Therefore, there is a certain normative inconsistency of norms. Namely, norms provide the ground upon which they can be broken. The example, of course, here is of Hindu yogis who use breath and the regulation of breathing as a one could say therapeutic technique of establishing new norms, which to a naive positivist, ignorant of the fluidity of physiology, would appear completely pathologically abnormal. If we develop this thought a little bit further, we can also say that there is a pathological consistency of norms. Namely, any small misunderstanding when one is sick, when one is in a pathological situation, can result in complete dissolution of the life form. Of course, I have to retract my criticism of Canguilhem. I actually, first time going through, I missed the importance of the education, though it's just in one citation. But nevertheless, I think it will be important. I will point out in what way it could be important later in the points for discussion. But of course, one should also consider in what way we are supposed to understand physiological constants now. And he actually maintains that they're not really constants, but rather functional optima for a specific environment. He provides this example of hypoglycemia in Blacks, in African people. And he says that by it, they're normalizing, they're searching for, they actually found a functional optima for their specific environment, which would, of course, by Western standards, be completely pathological. A nice citation to be seems to be this, that physiological constants are virtues in the old sense of the word, because he says that they kind of combine virtue, power, and function. And what does he mean by that? My interpretation is that he takes this familiar virtue ethic perspectives. If, for example, if one is suffering from gluttony, one starts to eat less. And by this, at first, one suffers. But in time, after some time, he establishes a habit which constructs its own way of satisfying a certain virtuous state. And then thus the gluttony is something that is painful, something that provides suffering. Of course, he also maintains that besides paleopathology and paleoanatomy, we should also consider paleophysiology, because if we take this normative aspect in its all radical glory, we cannot just compare people from different geographic regions, but also from different historical epochs. Of course, one could refer the reader here to Latour and his analysis of tuberculosis and the death of Ramesses II. But more interesting to me seems this maybe some of you know this channel, YouTube channel, PBS Eons. They made a video about the genes we lost along the way. And supposedly primates were able to synthesize their own vitamin C. And then we lost this ability at a certain point, but this did not result in a certain lack of adaptability because we started to eat fruit, which kind of, one could look at this, as we'll see in the next slide, as an externalization of a biological function. Of course, we should be careful because by this normativity, this functional plasticity, Canguilhem does not mean that organisms are completely malleable, and also that they're not purely individually plastic. I think this ties to his kind of brief mention of healthcare education. So in conclusion, norm and average are two different concepts. And physiology, though it should fix norms to remain objective, it should not disable them from correcting themselves. There exists also an interesting connection between man and technology. Namely, one could even call this a certain environmental normativity or technological and environmental epigenetics. That by externalization of functions, as we saw with the vitamin C, one is able to construct certain task closures which don't have their genetic seed in our organisms, but rather are established through traditions. So they establish environments within the establishment of certain norms, which wouldn't be meaningful in a pure natural environment, is made possible. Of course, we should also mention that he ends the chapter with this nice citation by which he tries to say that organism adapts and does not merely react to the environment. So discussion. First, I think the norm in contemporary medicine is at the same time shorthand for an error, but for an error in molecular mechanisms. But at the same time, the randomized control trials are kind of revitalizing this notion of statistical average and a statistical analysis in order to uncover the unknown unknowns. For example, also in principle unknowable molecular mechanisms. Perhaps Canguilhem's analysis could be applied to this field of philosophy, the philosophy of medicine. Then I think for development of truly novel understanding of health, we should search for a distinction between healthcare education and biopolitics, since biopolitics is something that Foucault, of course, develops from Canguilhem, probably also under the influence of him. But it seems that Canguilhem is emphasizing this some more individual connection to one's relationship to the environment, which is encapsulated, especially in humans, in this notion of health education. But I'm actually not sure how one should approach this problem. The third point is that if we once more compare Canguilhem to Gadamer as the second important philosopher, continental philosopher of health, we should pinpoint this really interesting difference. Namely, Gadamer seems to think that health is a complete and final organic state of complete balance of different forces. Therefore, diseases and problematic situations which could result in pathological phenomena are considered disasters to be avoided. The task of the physician is then to enable the patient to avoid these situations. While when one considers Canguilhem's point of view, we clearly see that this is not enough. The problematic situations are not just disasters to be avoided, but rather tasks to be normalized. There is the fluidity of norms. And since this fluidity is so important, I actually want to make a more metaphorical comment here about the use of the metaphor of melodies for denoting what it means to be an organism, right? Uexküll says, and also Goldstein says, we saw, so Merleau-Ponty also says, and we saw in Canguilhem that he also compares organic phenomena to music. But since there is this complete flexibility, I would maintain actually that a particular organism does not sing just one melody, but there are multiple different melodies that are at the same time, but also at different temporal and spatial points. Of course, one then has to ask, what establishes the individuality of this singing of different melodies? Because we still interact with one organism, which kind of, in some sense, stays the same. Actually, I think we should include the concept of theme, which is different from melodies since it never quite presents itself. It is the concept by which we in musical business kind of describe in which way melodies, though they're different, are in some essential structural sense the same. And of course, Schoenberg, one of the foremost theoreticians of contemporary music, actually talked a lot about and was fond of this expression of that theme lives. You should, within a piece of music, establish a certain life of a theme. What I would like to express here, actually, that's like now in film music, actually, at the beginning of the 20th century, music that people encounter in their everyday life consisted only of cliches. Today, Adorno started to call these cliches, which are very much used in film music, reified melodies. So kind of signifiers who don't really express an emotion, but point to it. One could see this very clearly in the latest Star Wars movies, where music kind of really, in a sense, sucks. It doesn't express anything. It just, one could even say it tells a story, but not as music, but as like pictures or something. And actually, now, how can one transcend this holism of cliches, which is completely static, rigid, as Gadamer would say about health? And Schoenberg actually did this radical modernist gesture. He stopped composing for 1 year and developed a system that tried to do away with all the meaning that was established so far. And that was the dodecaphone system. What he did by that is to formalize a new horizon of sound, which could then be implemented to create so-called Farbenmelodien. So the melodies that are not composed like we normally think of notes of different heights, pitches, but rather as melodies of color. And of course, this can result in complete mathematics, and in fact it did, in complete mathematization of melodies. But on the other hand, every single piece of music that works with these colors, and that is basically every successful piece from David Bowie, Billie Eilish, contemporary music, classical music like John Luther Adams and such, who deal with these colors, establish a new way of perceiving meaning within a melody. And I think that the same should be applied to the explication of organisms, right? There have to be certain ruptures, even reductionist or mechanistic, in order to open up new horizons within which normativity can be expressed. And for me, molecular biology is a prime example of this, since though it was very reductionist, it enabled a new view upon the organism, namely the autopoietic view, which wouldn't be able to function, to take on meaning if the reductionist aspects did not develop the technical capabilities of kind of manipulating the genetic material and proteins. That's it. Thank you. Okay. I would be actually very interested in what you think all about the last point. I actually realized it just reading this this chapter, since it kind of explicates the difference, the kind of conflation of different ways of conceiving meaning in Goldstein. Since he says meaning is not complete, the essence of the organism is not complete, yet we are capable of approaching it. I think Canguilhem would actually not talk about, I didn't really check, but I wouldn't say he would talk about approaching, but rather kind of oscillations between distances between the biological researchers and the organisms, which depend always on that organisms adapt to a finite amount of environments, and we're not able to construct this system of adaptability as such. Every new environment is actually kind of uncovering new ways an organism could adapt.
Can you say again, why do you think music in Star Wars is not expressive? I didn't understand why.
The new music is not very expressive. The old one, I think, is quite brilliant, but the new music is actually, that's what people call reification. So a melody becomes so transparent that it's used like a sign for a certain meaning. And for example, so for a certain person, it used to be that music kind of developed the scene in which a person or a certain concept like the force, for example, very famous motive, appeared or played some part. But nowadays, especially in the last 3 movies, I think everybody actually kind of in the music world thinks that the music doesn't express or kind of enrich the scene, but it just points like, he came here.
Okay. I disagree a little bit. I think in Last Jedi, the music was perfect, but in other two, it was bad. But I don't know anything about the other things you were saying, so I'm gonna let others speak.
I would have 2 quick comments because I missed out on most of your presentation, so fortunately I haven't been able to absorb it fully. But 2 very brief remarks. One remark would be, I always find it a bit problematic when the narrative turns towards the idea of contemporary something showing signs of very, very clear decadence or very, very clear simplicity or things of that nature. So the story about contemporary film music and pop music in general, we've had this discussion becoming very banal, trivial, and so on and so forth. You know, this has been an ongoing theme since forever. So when do we reach the point where it truly becomes like decadent and falls apart? It would seem it just keeps postponing, and then the new generation sees the other generation as really decadent, they themselves not being decadent. This is, you know, just a little bit to perhaps provoke you in a sense, because I think we've already had a similar discussion, and I've had a similar discussion with Adnan as well. This idea of, I'm not sure that maybe this is because we stem from different backgrounds. You know, you being basically a brilliant musician and extremely well-educated musician who is completely submerged in the nuances of the classical music, and myself being an amateur musician who knows a little bit about music and kind of follows the themes or the genres that I find appealing in one way or another. But this idea of like there being a specific complexity within the classical music and then these other offshoots becoming somehow reified holisms, and then we have to get away from this to achieve a more proper, it sounds like a lot of intellectualism, but not necessarily something that I find particularly convincing. So that's just one aspect. So this question about the degeneracy, so to speak, or simplicity, or what? How would you put it? Schematism of music?
I don't think one should talk about simplicity.
Okay, but
Yeah.
we can get to this. So the reification, becoming very transparent, like there's a clear reference point and things of that nature. That's one thing. And then the other thing is, I don't see how molecular biology was necessary for the development of the autopoietic conception of life, when you basically have a very similar idea, almost identical idea, and this is something that Varela, for instance, gets to in his last paper in Kant already. In 1790, when he published his Critique of Judgment, his conception of organism is basically almost identical as the one presented by people who developed the autopoietic conception. So he basically there claims that the organism is both the cause and the result of itself. So it's a strange entity, a strange phenomenon, where you basically cannot do the mechanical, that is to say, causal account of it, and you have to take the whole into account, because you cannot understand the parts without understanding the whole. And basically, the parts exist to produce the whole. Whole is there to enable parts to produce the whole. So there's like this strange interrelation that already Kant, encountered. So I don't see how the molecular biological disruption that you mentioned is necessary or constitutive of development of theories such as autopoiesis. So that those would be two comments on what I've heard.
Yeah, actually, I wouldn't say that it's impossible to kind of draw a line from autopoiesis to Kant. I would say actually that so autopoiesis actually explicitly uses certain developments in cybernetics and especially in the kind of it's starting from the information theory of life, right? And it reconfigures it in a, of course, Kantian meaning. But I wouldn't say that there's this formal aspect that stays the same. I think that the notions of this is not very well developed. I have to, it's like just a very recent idea. But I feel that information language for Kant wouldn't really make sense. This kind of, the membrane actually, I don't think it would make sense so much for Kant. Actually, I read somewhere that Hegel was talking about membranes, but I'm not sure. But I would say that those kinds of concepts and the concept of genetic code wouldn't make sense to Kant at all. And these are all essential elements. Of course, one could say the formal element is the same, but it appears in a completely new light. And I would actually maintain, yeah, this kind of perceptual epistemic vitalism of understanding a living being as different from material stays. I mean, it repeats, it iterates, but the approaches to it are, because the technique of approaching it is so different, the meaning of the concept kind of changes. It pinpoints to different ways of approaching it, of understanding what it means that the organism produces itself. And maybe the simplicity comment, yeah, I wouldn't say it's so much about simplicity as it is about yeah, this is a very subjectivist account, my subjective account, but you really feel when there's kind of this, and most of pop music actually is that, but not degrading it. This is an important function, but it heavily references a certain social milieu, right? And that's what became extremely important. So in the last century, so the pop music was actually a way people formed groups. This, of course, also happened with classical music, but it seems that classical music, of course, it was also, like I mentioned, Boulez. I don't know if I mentioned, he was especially, like, he was constructing his own way of his own group, in which he was basically a god. And when he died, everybody in France was extremely happy, right? Because they could finally, like, get on with their lives. They didn't have to worry about Boulez, what he would say, and so on. But even in classicism, for example, so Mozart and Beethoven, this important shift from kind of being in service of a baron or a king or an archbishop, to being in service of the city people, the folk, right? Of course, now a new group is finished, but it's established. But I think there is a certain, I mean, I would ascribe that also to people like Billie Eilish and David Bowie, that there's a certain kind of this normativity, right? It enables the enlargement of meaning, the inclusion of other styles. But if you have completely rarefied a piece of music, it references and it's static in this kind of radically social sense, that it points to, that it functions as a complete signifier, right? Because we know the kind of Star Wars is part of our tradition, we can understand it. But if somebody else would come, they would have a really hard time to understanding what it is about, the music, probably something along those lines.
But I'm not sure that that's a particularly convincing argument. Like a very concrete empirical counter argument would be the development of most of the classical music in the Russian setting. They basically were contributing primarily, like significantly, even essentially, to the development of national sentiment in Russia. I forgot which centuries, and but I read it in the what's it called, the Natasha Stand. And there you have, how strongly embedded the development of the classical music was there in the development of this idea or notion that there is such a thing as a Russian soul with its specific dynamics, and that it kind of manifests itself in different areas and dimensions of life in a unique way. And I would say that, what you've just described with regards to the pop music and it's being related to a specific social or, let's say, societal setting, that was also equally true for the Russian development of this Russian romanticism. And I would say that, equally true also for many of the developments in other domains of classical music. The deep interpenetration with between some of the classical masterpieces and the development of educated bourgeoisie and whatnot. So how is that different?
I mean, for example,
I think we can go further back into ancient Greece, actually, and like we tend to glorify these old sculptures of the famous politicians of ancient Greece and so forth, but like in this milieu of ancient Greece, it was really a very distinct social function which these artists were performing. It was really bound up with the social context of it, and I don't think there was anything less reified in a certain sense than something like in Star Wars. I think the difference is somewhere else.
I mean, why can't we just say that art or music in particular can be valuable, more or less valuable, regardless of whether it also expresses some kind of national sentiment or social milieu or whatever? mean, we don't necessarily have to tie both of these questions into one.
Yeah, I would basically, agree here, and I think that that's the reason why I don't find the argument being proposed particularly convincing. It would seem that eventually, sooner or later, you get some types of reifications within a given context, because specific ways of doing music, to give just this example, eventually ends up expressing a certain something, and it becomes a specific way of signifying something. And now this can be done differently, but from a broader perspective, especially if you look at it from a meta perspective, or let's say retrospectively. So, looking at something backward, then you see these patterns emerging, I would say. So I'm just wondering, or I'm curious as to how this would be, let's say, qualitatively or profoundly different from the contemporary Star Wars music.
Actually, if one considers the Peterka, the Russian Peterka that you mentioned, it's not completely true that they developed a uniquely Russian melos. Sure, they developed it in this sense as they institutionalized it. They applied Western approaches to developing it. But the main point is actually here that Rimsky-Korsakov, the one of the Peterka, was actually crucial for the development of impressionism in France, for the Ravel and Debussy. Of course, Debussy and Ravel, they all there's always this tendency to pick kind of folk motives. Even in Schubert and in Mozart, and especially in Beethoven, you can find a lot of these folk motives which are incorporated, right? So there's always this dialogue, but there is something special in the way they develop it. As I tried to point out, like there are novel ways in which they these themes can get transformed. And these ways were not really, they were completely invisible, completely hidden from the ears of those who used them as signifiers, because they are they don't care about how it sounds, they care about what it expresses, or rather what it signifies. Well, when you have this kind of transposition of a certain sound in which in a certain culture it means something, in a different culture it has and then culture, like institution, for example, this transition from Rimsky-Korsakov to Debussy, what was essential here is the appearance of the notion of color, which is essential for impressionism, and then gets radically transformed by Schoenberg, as I said. But this ability to transpose a certain way of thinking into a different milieu, and in that milieu it can have a life of its own. But the problem is, if we approach to these melodies as completely transparent tools of signifying something, because then we are not focusing on what and how they sound, and what are those inexpressible vectors that we could discover there. And I think this is something that reification misses, right? Because in earlier Star Wars, you really can hear these developments, and they're actually normative in this sense, and not actually so much, because all of film music is basically this way. But in every original composer, that is considered original, you can compare it to other composers, and you can really see that there's a certain wells of meaning that you can only discover by considering how things sound, not what they mean. And then out of this sound, you can produce different stuff. But this is radically different from the melody that we consider transparent and understand as a reified signifier.
Yeah, I'm going to let this one drop so as not to go too deeply into the musical metaphor, because there are other topics that were covered in the text itself. So yeah, that was just a general comment. So I leave the podium to others now.
I don't think it's like music in general, not this topic specifically, but this analogy between life and music is very interesting. Like all the metaphors that offer themselves up to us. And for example, if you look at Schopenhauer, he was very insistent that the very essence of life is ultimately kind of similar to the way music works. And I think there is something to these comparisons. For example, if we try to look at normativity within music, I'm not really an academic musician, so you're going to have to correct me if I say anything wrong here. For example, how do you establish, in terms of tonality, a norm within a certain work? Like you have in a certain key, a certain center around which all the other pitches gravitate. And that's basically kind of the way one can understand a key. But then what I'm trying to kind of find is some kind of parallel between this musical norm, the way a norm is established in this musical sense, and how it's established in the biological or organismic sense. Because in a musical sense, we have this clear idea. Okay, so there's this key, this basic tone, or these basic tones, which serve as the kind of the anchor of the I guess the organism of music. Whereas in life, it's much more difficult in organisms, like Canguilhem shows very very precisely, to determine what these tones could possibly be. Like there's a lot of ways to go about it, which are basically dead ends. So yeah, I'm just basically rambling because I don't know if maybe it lights any bulbs in your minds about it, but I think there's something to it, to trying to just understand biological normativity by comparing it to musical normativity. But yeah.
Dimos, I would just add something, and this I would be then really interested to hear other people's opinions, because for sure it is really important to kind of find suitable metaphors that allow you to talk about something, that allow you to somehow serve as some sort of a thinking or cognitive template of sorts, where you basically have a certain something that allows you to think the phenomenon that you're confronted with in a way that's very productive. And the notion of melody was indeed very productive in this regard. And again, is like, you know, I might say some of the stuff that's not theoretically strictly correct here, but there are at least some things that, like, there are two aspects that usually get brought up when the melody is mentioned, and why it is useful for the understanding of living beings. One thing is that you might have a certain note in different contexts, so play the same note played in different contexts, and it acquires a different quality and a different dynamic. That's very interesting, because basically you don't have like isolated or isolable parts, but what you have is an aspect that acquires a specific dynamic, that acquires a specific dimension only within the context in which it appears. That's one thing. Another thing, and this one I find more and more interesting the more I think about it, is if you play a certain sequence of tones, once you produce this, the continuation, in order to be in line or in sync with the laws of melody or what have you, can only go in specific directions. So they are, if you produce like a sequence of 3 notes, after this, you can only take this into several directions, not in infinite possible directions that you can take this, you know. So you're kind of, there is a certain prescribed way that you can solve the tension that you have created. Okay, there is a certain intention present in what you've created. This is very interesting. There is a certain tension, you know, that can be resolved in very specific ways. And now comes the most interesting part for me. Once you do take a certain route, so the final note that you play changes the whole, so even the first note. So the first note acquire a specific dynamic once the melody is finished, in line with how it was finished. So not only do you have a whole in the sense of a specific tone acquires a specific quality in a specific context, but you also have a temporal whole, where in a certain sense, what is given already shows to something, points to something. So there is a certain futurity present in this. And the final note changes the whole, so it changes the beginning as well, the quality of the note at the very beginning. So this I find interesting. So this is the reason why, for example, people get fascinated with melodies and find them useful as metaphors of that could be used in the domain of living beings, of organisms.
Just one quick note about the last thing you said about the final note basically changing the meaning of the others. I think a very interesting phenomenon is if you have a song in like a minor key, like the very sad sounding chords, and then there are some ways that you can basically, the final chord, you raise the third and make a major chord, and it's just the final chord which you change. And it's a very interesting like a very interesting feeling to have this very sad song and then it ends on a bright major chord, and it basically reconfigures, recontextualizes the entire song in a way.
Yeah, actually, I think we should be careful with the use of the tonal paradigm, because so the melody we decide upon, the melody that seems normal to us, that seems to follow the resolution of a certain tension, is actually heavily mediated by the way we listen to the melody. That's why I tried to show it Schoenberg. If you listen to his melodies, like you would listen to Chopin, it doesn't function. Really, you don't hear anything. There's a specific way of listening to them, and then a whole new work appears. That's the first point. Then we think of tonality as something natural, but it's highly, highly artificial. So basically, we're always, when we sing, that's the problem in string quartet, for example. So the piano is tuned in a certain way that actually violates the absolute pure intonation that, for example, Pythagoras intonation, which follows from the laws of acoustics. So, and by this, it tries to, with minimal differences, trick our ear into not hearing them exactly. So basically, if you have a just intonation, the very lowest key on the keyboard and the very highest are going to be out of tune completely, right? And the way we approach melodies is actually very, very much tied to this technical aspect of singing a melody, because before this temperament, this way of tuning was developed, you had really complicated ways in which melody sounded, normal, and in which it did not. And it was really a science, almost a science, basically. By then music was one of the quadrivium, I think. You had very complex ways of singing which sounded good. Now this changed with the introduction of different technologies, namely the piano and a specific tuning system. So, and then of course, because Bach used it, because Mozart, Beethoven, Chopin, Sibelius, everybody used it, it seems now to us, to our ears, which are attuned to actually romantic way of approaching music, are stuck in the 19th century, that this is one natural way. There's a final amount of ways one can resolve the tension. I would contend, actually, no. We don't know all the ways one could resolve the tension, because we don't know all the techniques one could use to construct the melody. And the techniques one uses to construct the melody kind of, first of all, they cannot be deduced from the natural way of understanding. There's no kind of gestalt of melody which encapsulates, I mean, there's a gestalt of melody in the sense that a melody starts, finishes, and there's probably, it begins and the ends all in kind of the same note, and then it oscillates about for some time up around the top note. That's as far as kind of formal interpretation of melody can go. And even this is dubious. But this approach that there is this fixed way of resolving tension is, to me, something I realized was very wrong when I started to really kind of approach contemporary music, and also to understand Baroque and classical music in the ways that are appropriate to them. For example, why don't we feel anything when we listen to Mozart? Because his use of melodies and his use of harmonies, of tonality, so the way he constructs the tension and resolves it is completely different from the way romantics do it. So we don't feel anything, but that doesn't mean that we possess a certain way of truly understanding a melody and kind of understanding in which way it develops. Right? It's heavily predicated on in this case, compositional technique. In classicist period, you have this immense appreciation for the form. So actually the harmonies function in a formal way. You still have the tonica and dominanta, but they have formal significations. In romantic music, for example, they have much more expressive signification. You have the same, you can have, I mean, this is especially, probably some of you know the Sibelius violin concerto. This is especially clear in kind of the way he plays with a specific way of constructing melody, which is very, the relationship between melody and harmony, which then, of course, kind of tells us how the melody can and cannot develop in a very kind of Scandinavian way. And there's specific sound, a specific way of resolving tension. If you don't know how to follow it, most of us, of course, know because it's still a romantic piece in this case. But if you don't know the dynamic in which Bach develops it, in which Palestrina or Mozart or Beethoven develop it, you're not going to be able to really follow. That's what I mean by a radical different view of life. Like all of a sudden, you can like formally describe what it means for a bacteria to be alive and what it means for a virus to not be alive. And that's something that was not really possible before.
The thing is, what you've been talking about, I think it's even more reason to be encouraged to take up these themes. When you say, yeah, there are different ways of, I don't know, trying to determine a kind of way how to navigate music. So, okay, you have this Western concept of the tonic, the dominant and everything, and other cultures, and even in the past in the West, you had different approaches to navigating music. But it's the same with life, actually. Like there were different ways organisms achieve their normativity. And I think in this chapter, actually, Canguilhem talks about the Neanderthal, which had a host of anatomical features or characteristics, which would to us be basically pathological, even like this dysfunctional, whereas for the Neanderthal, they were basically just part of his norm. And this is another, I think, aspect where the musical metaphor is useful again, because it shows again how we're always inventing ways in different cultures, in different mindsets, in different historical periods. But the thing is that is interesting that there is, I think there's an inherent normativity in all of this musical activity, just like in life. Because in every culture, you ultimately do achieve a certain kind of norm, like even in Indian music, which to us seems so alien, they have rules and everything. So it does seem to kind of reflect the musical rules, the statistical averages, maybe, if we, or I don't know if we try to compare it with biological language, or the ideal types for whatever. They indicate inherent normativity of music, just as in the biological and the physiological world, they indicate an inherent normativity of life.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly why I brought it up, because I feel that's exactly what you said.
Yeah, but the thing is that what Primož said was, in a certain sense, the formal dynamics, the formal anatomy of the metaphor of music or the melody, it seems to hold, you know? So it doesn't really change much if you add what you just said. So even if there are different ways of resolving a certain tension, I have no issues whatsoever in agreeing with this, because it depends on the life form that you're studying. But what goes without saying, and this still holds true, there are specific ways of resolving tension within a given context. And this would hold true for a specific life form. Well, look, you cannot resolve a specific melody without getting out of the. Yeah, well, you know, what you're doing now is you're taking different styles from different eras and you're putting them together and you're providing this meta view and you're trying to say, well, it's not only how the romantics do it. This is wrong way of thinking. I have no issues whatsoever agreeing with it. But once you're functioning within the context of the romantic music, there are only specific ways of doing it. Of course, you can do it differently. You can do it differently. You can add different ways of approaching it, just like different life forms can manifest themselves differently. But by you saying that it's like almost completely contingent, if you say this kind of loses all its value whatsoever in a certain sense, because
we're not saying that. We're not saying that it's contingent. I mean, at least what I try to point out is that it's not contingent.
Yeah. I'm actually, what I'm saying is in sync with what you're saying. I'm not sure that I'm in sync with what Isaac is saying, though, because
Can I say that something?
No, but look, you said that basically you have different types of resolving certain things, and this were somehow historically and culturally determined. And once you have this, you get certain gestalten within this specific way of doing it. And I would say that the same holds true in the world of life as well. But it's not completely contingent when you're looking at a specific life form. So this is where you started shaking your head away. So it's not the melody, the resolution would be of a specific type for, say, a given plant or a given, you know, I'm not saying that it would be predetermined for life in general.
And that's my problem with actually, because this type is extremely hard to develop, to ascribe to an individual, as we saw with Vondry, right? That the regulation of a certain type is problematic because a type can change, especially with the introduction of cure. To me, this cure is something very radical, because if you take, for example, this way of differentiating between inside and outside in autopoiesis and even in free energy principle, that you have this way of introducing a certain limit which ensures that the kind of the organizational closure, because nothing else can really interact with it to kind of disturb this organization. For me, cure is exactly this. It transgresses the membrane. It interacts with the organization in a novel way, in a not predictable way. And this is what I find so fascinating with Canguilhem, because it's not true that the same type or the same organism is not going to react in the same environment if it's kind of transformed in the right way. So, for example, if one, as he describes it, norms can change. So one can gradually change norms in such a way as to normalize himself to a different environment. And if then there's this abrupt transposition of the organism into the previous environment, perhaps this is going to be pathological. He's not going to be able to cope with it. And that's something radical. I mean, I would maintain that there's this continuity here, that one cannot just throw it all around. But I think this is something that Canguilhem does really right, that you don't have this fixed meaning, as I tried to say. You can't really approach the organisms. There are these oscillations of difference, the distance between me and the organisms, which change depending on how his organization in a particular environment is structured. So I wouldn't maintain that it's completely arbitrary, right? There has to be continuity, but at the same time, I would not say that this can be self-sufficient. Like you you catch yourself in this hermeneutic circle of trying to establish any analytic fact that you gather back into the holistic appreciation for the organism. I would say that this does not function. Of course, once you have this immense set of analytic facts, you can synthesize it in that way. But there's a reason that molecular biology had to be developed in order for autopoiesis to take shape. It was not like the first time they even realized there was something weird about proteins that Varela was there and talking about this stuff. No, it first had to be, there had to be this large set of analytic facts, completely reductionistic. Then you can say, yeah, but you don't really capture the essence of living. You have to do this. And then all of a sudden, everything falls into place. But there's not, I have the problem with this hermeneutic circle that Goldstein wants to impose. So every analytic fact should be included in the holistic interpretation. To me, this methodology, yeah, it's unable to think this normalization to a different environment.
Maybe just one more riff on this musical theme that we started, is how would we how to put this? Is the key of a song the statistical average chord, I guess, which the song returns to? Because it's really not. Like in music, we see that, for example, in Tristan und Isolde, you have like 4 hours of no tonic, no home key, no home chord, and there's just this constant tension. So just like in life, we also can't apply this statistical view of, I mean, if we understand this tonality of this key as the home, the norm, which sort of the organism or the musical work gravitates around. So in music, we also can't just look at it statistically. But then the question is, how do we determine the key, the home chord, which ends the song? I mean, like in musical theory, it's functional, but what does it really mean, and how could we compare that to biology? That a home key is basically just, what does it mean that it's the functional end or start to the song? I don't know.
Actually, musical theory is more or less just the average specification of the norm, especially like Renaissance counterpoint. When you learn it, it's just this happens most often, this happens a little less often, this almost never happens. Mm-hmm. Right? And then, of course, they transform it into norms, right? If you do this, you're right. If you do this, you get half a point. If you do this, you get no point. But precisely from this third point, actually, that is considered wrong, a whole new way of approaching melody approach developed. Sorry. Yeah. So I think the same problem. That's what fascinated me. I didn't really get, because when I was thinking a lot about this connection between music and organisms, it always seemed to me, yeah, but organisms are existing there, and you can recognize them, right? They're different from the melody, who you have to, as Merleau-Ponty so nicely put somewhere, that you like trace the melody. You trace a certain movement, for example, of an object. It's not, you don't quite see it. You have to trace it. You have to especially know how to trace it. But actually with this, I realized, no, with life, it's the same, because you have all these technological means by which you understand life, with which you trace life. But there are always these ruptures, this unpredictable changes of meaning that you cannot trace. But at the same time, they produce kind of a new way of approaching phenomena, which is not holistic because you're not able to trace it. But when you kind of think about, oh, that's a nice sound, how can I implement that? Then you can, by discovering that sound completely analytically and reductionistically, one could say, you can construct new ways of establishing what it means to trace a melody, to hear a melody, or in this case, to trace the loop of the organism, right?
Okay, so, well, you have these ruptures, right? But, and I'm very sympathetic to your view, Isaac, but still I wonder, like, okay, so in the case of the metaphor of the melody, like you have ruptures between different styles of music, right? But still the question remains, what allows you to make the identification, or let's say that you acknowledge something as a piece of music? Like something has to remain, some structure has to remain in place, right? Wouldn't you say, like you use the metaphor of a resolving attention, which I find quite telling, but maybe, yeah, if anybody had anything to say, elaborate on that.
This is something I was thinking basically, because in my experimentations with music, at a certain point, I ended up in probably the most extreme forms of music that there are, and the probably most extreme version of, if this is even music, is called noisecore. So noisecore or electro noisecore. And this is basically, as the name itself suggests, noise. So for example, we've had a concert once in Murska Sobota, where two guys who were playing noisecore came and they were selling their merchandise, and basically the merchandise was a piece of wood. It wasn't even a proper CD. So that was telling enough. And what they were doing was, you know, so what Timothy is saying, I think that there's a certain point to what he's saying. So I was thinking about these things, which are, you know, sure, there are different ways of structure in music, and but why do people gravitate towards the romantic solution? Why do many people do not adopt the modernist style? Why do so few people listen to grindcore and noisecore? You know, I mean, you can get into it, of course, and you're kind of moving in areas and dimensions that are somehow music, you know. I mean, in very significant ways. You can basically enter into a very cacophonous type and style of music, such as grindcore, which is really, really atonal and really basically goes in the direction of killing the aesthetics of music as much as possible. Yeah. Maybe Adam, just before you add your thoughts, there's something I wanted to also share with you, which I found very interesting. It is an example that is given by Hans Selye, you know, the guy who developed the notion of stress. I mentioned him at the first meeting. He was not particularly mouse friendly, let's put it that way. So they were doing a lot of experiments with poor rats and mice. And in one experiment, they did something, I forgot the details, but it was something like putting mice in cold water or something like that, and then putting mice in the fridge. And then, you know, some mice died off and then some survived. And the ones that survived, you know, they were kind of monitoring the stress reaction. These mice, so the mice that survived, they actually got used to the new environment. So basically, they got used to the harsh conditions in a way that they would basically function normally here. But the funny thing is, this would occur or happen only for a certain amount of time. So for 2 or 3 weeks, they would be able to function seemingly completely normally. And then all of a sudden, they would just break down and die way more quickly than mice in different environments. So you might say, you know, okay, so they've developed specific ways of resolving the tension, but clearly one that is not as good as the one that was previously. So if they had the opportunity, they would move to the former environment. So I'm not saying, you know, one might say eventually new mice would develop that would live in this environment. So the story goes, right? But it's just something that also crossed my mind about this, you know, what is it that determines then where, for example, where do you get like a specific attractor, so to speak, in a specific time period towards which the majority gravitates, you know?
Well, maybe I'd like to just comment on the grindcore remark. I think one thing to keep in mind is that we're still dealing, even in extreme forms of music like that, we're still dealing with tones. They might be distorted, you know, they have a very specific color to them, but they're still tones. And one way of demonstrating that is there's a pianist, a Russian or Ukrainian pianist, I can't remember her name, but I noticed she takes some grindcore songs, for example, Carcass, early Carcass, you know, stuff that's really cacophonous as it gets. And she essentially did a rendition of that for the piano with minimal changes. I mean, no changes to the melodic structure, just slightly substituting notes on the piano for stuff that you cannot really play on the piano. And it's music, essentially. That's the point. It might be hard to recognize unless you're used to that specific style, that specific way that the sound is distorted, but you know, you still got tones there. Now that might be a bit less true for noisecore and similar genres, but in most of them, even the most extreme ones, we're still dealing with tones. So we can still stick to that definition.
Slightly less extreme example for me personally is like Tom Waits. I really like his music, but I hate the way he sings. Like he's just growling all the time. And but it's interesting if you give his songs to sing to a different singer, you can actually recognize much more of the melody and the melodiousness of the song than when he's basically growling it out like crazy.
Just wanted to mention that I've added one of the first CDs by Carcass, if anybody's interested, and so that you know what Adnan was referring to. So Carcass are one of the beginners of what is called technically the gore grind subgenre of grindcore.
You're getting really deep here.
Well, you know, Isaac can say all that stuff about the classical music.
Sure.
Exactly.
Actually, this was a good point. I haven't thought about it. And I actually don't know how to approach it. There is complete malleability in music. If you're just insistent enough, you can listen to anything, right? Now.
Yeah, but you've always got rules. That's the point.
Sorry?
You've always got tones, and you've always got some sort of rules that you need to follow.
I mean, I didn't want to get into a semantic question about music. I think this is where the analogy between music and life breaks down, right? Because you can listen to anything and call it music, and you can even say you enjoy it. I mean, you could enjoy noise. But I really wouldn't want to go into a discussion about what constitutes art, because I think here there's like a very concrete difference. I mean, if you're talking about life, then you what I wanted to say was this: like you could have like different forms of life, but there is I would insist that there is some kind of a structural dynamics that stays the same. That you have to that you can grasp independently of its particular instantiations, and this is where I think the analogy to music doesn't apply, because music could like transcend all structural all its structural characteristic in my view, whereas in life I think it could not.
Yeah, I would
but can it actually transcend structure? Because I mean, even if you record complete noise, you package it in a certain time-limited frame, and that's already structure. You've already given it some kind of meaning, imposed something upon it. So I think it has similar limits to how it has similar limits in what it can be to life. So I don't think the analogy breaks down quite yet.
And just by the way, I've added the piano version of a song by Carcass just so you can check it out. I mean, it's dark, it's very dark, but it's music. That's just so you know what I'm talking about. And continue.
Somber.
Yeah, actually, what I would say is that this structural element, as at least I understand Canguilhem, it comes from pathology. It comes from finite amount of adaptations that you encounter. There's never a complete account of everything that an organism can achieve. Like there's much more to physiology than we know. So I'm very skeptical because it's always going to be much more than we know. Of course, we can construct and say, okay, this is a reasonable approximation of the organization that we encounter in these specific environments. But what happens when we encounter a novel environment? That's the point with me. I wouldn't contend that in a specific environment, the organism, in a specific time point, the organism is in a certain organization. Of course, the problem is this epistemologically feasible to access this organization? But surely there is, and we can approach it. But the problem actually comes, how do we know that there are not radical transformations dormant in the organism that would arise when we put it into another context? That's actually my point, that it's really problematic to talk about structure if you don't take into account that this structure is only accessed through pathology and finite physiology.
Yes, I would agree. I mean, here I'm personally more interested in the question about life, and here I would say, like, well, I'm very much interested currently exactly with this distinction with what could stay what must stay fixed, like the same, and what can change in your conception of the organism. And I'm pretty, I mean, sympathetic that this almost everything can change, like material, of course, even some basic structural characteristics. But I think you remain fixed still in a kind of a shallow, let's say, conception of structure if you insist that everything could change. Like if you say, if you propose like a autopoietic conception of the organism, then I think its autopoietic structure could not ever change. Like this is an example for me that where this, you cannot go beyond it. I mean, if you were to go beyond it, then you wouldn't be talking about life or the organism. You would have some other kind of being.
I think mine is a methodological point, in the sense that if autopoietic researchers come to an organism and say, in these specific determined exact experimental conditions, the same way Bernard did, then I have no problem with that. They specified what are the exact, and that's how science works. Like this, first you specify the method. Okay, and with this method and within this environment, the organism functions in that way. And we can describe this organism in his organization, but that does not mean this organization can't change, right? And this change is itself something we were talking about before the last time, about this virtual and actual. I would say that this change is something that escapes this scheme. It just happens. It's not something that is in your horizon, right? In the same way as I was thinking also, sorry for bringing this up, but it seemed like a really good analogy with contemporary improvised music, which is basically just taking some sounds and trying to make music out of them. And the one problematic thing that you can do, the one thing you should never do, is pause and think what you're doing. You should always just do, because the moment you pause and think what you're doing, there is this tendency to perform cliches, to restrict yourself to what sounds good to you. Of course, you can always grapple with this on the verge of nonsense, but there is always this completely new, unpredictable aspect of improvisation. And that's the way how I could understand that in a specific, once the improvisation is finished and it's recorded, sure, you can analyze it all you want. But in the moment that it's happening, I think that later Canguilhem develops this notion of error, that it's important that we are capable of erring, because only by erring can we know the truth. And only by erring can actually, I think, organisms adapt to environments. So there is this essential element of almost kind of, you could call it blind normativity. Because Bernard, for example, he talks a lot, so Claude Bernard, he talks a lot about the blind technique involved in experimenting. The things just happen. You construct something and that something happens. And this was not, it was not predicted from this relationship, just as an example, from last time, the actual and virtual. It was something completely new. And this is the way, actually, the contact with improvisational music that my brother does was the first that really pinpointed this problem of specifying organization and forgetting to specify the environment, the context.
I'm sorry, I'll
yeah,
just return one more time to boring formalisms, then we can talk about music again. You mentioned Markov blanket, right? So here, I think again, if you pose this in terms of the Markov blanket, then you already have a kind of individual, a structure of individuation, which you mustn't change if you are to understand the transformations that are viable to that individual, right? The very structure of the Markov blanket is something that you cannot get rid of. This is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
And it has certain material and formal properties. So it's not just just an empty term, I think.
No, it's not. I mean, you can, that's what I'm trying to say, but yeah, it's really hard to say it probably, to that in a determined conditions, right? I mean, so actually, when the organizational structure changes, for example, by the introduction of a new environment, radically new environment, or the cure, as I think Canguilhem would say, that when you introduce the cure, something radical happens, like organism is not the same as before. Something really weird happens. And actually, by that, sure, the Markov blanket changes, but the organization is different. So if you want to equate the individual with the organization established within a certain Markov blanket, then you cannot explain in what way this individual, when it's introduced, when it gets to the point where it needs to cure itself, remains the same individual, because then you would have these kind of monads of different organizations. And that's also, I don't think, I mean, probably practically it might be a good way to approach things, but I mean, to model ontology of life in this way, I would be, in my opinion, not very.
But yeah. I think that I know what Timothy is getting at. If you basically go down the line that you're proposing, you basically lose almost everything. You know, at least Markov blanket and autopoiesis and things like that are formal criteria or organizational or systemic criteria that are determinable. And somebody might say, sure, there are different ways of instantiating this and different ways of manifesting it, and they can be dynamic and whatnot and temporal. But still, like, these are the criteria that are crucial for the individuation at the level of the living being. And your point is basically, yeah, but then, you know, things can change, and then there are these ruptures and you don't know what will happen. And basically what happens is, with you, life becomes like some sort of a magic. It's not really a methodological point. It's like, you don't really know what's going to happen. It's just like, it's completely, in a certain sense, almost open. I don't see you in any meaningful way proposing any criteria whatsoever that would be helpful either philosophically or scientifically. But you saying that there are ruptures and changes, I don't see how this is useful in the long term.
You could put it in these terms, like you could say, if you're talking about transformation or plasticity, then you have to have some sort of a principle of individuation in place. Otherwise, you would just have an unrelated succession of events, right? And this isn't a transformation of anything. It's just a random succession. So what I'm trying to say is, even if you're talking about like a medicament in the Derrida, again, it's not just a random event that replaces what came before it. It's something that the organism integrates within its own structure, that in turn changes its structure, but the structuring of structure remains the same, right? This is something I want to bring home. I mean,
but even this formal aspect of a boundary is, for me, in a sense, completely devoid of any meaning, since it's not just that there's a boundary. Of course, you can say that, but the problem is to measure this boundary, right? You have to, in Markov blanket, you have to measure the informational relatedness between different nodes. In membrane, you have to kind of, in the autopoiesis membrane, you have to somehow define not define, actually measure, to specify the physical manifestation of this limit that makes the organizational aspects possible. So I don't think it's that easy just to say there are formal aspects, because there's this essential element of what it means to measure a formal aspect. And
what is then a positive account of what you're proposing? I don't see a positive account of any sort in what you're kind of trying to put forward.
The methodological and kind of metaphorical way of Goldstein's hermeneutic circle is not, it's gonna just run around the same environment, around the same organism. That's my exact point. The point is that we should allow for this erroneous development of reductionist meaning in order to gain novel perspectives on the holistic interpretation. That's what my point is, that if you go by Goldstein's rules, this, of course, he kind of anticipates it because there are these radical ruptures when everything changes, but I don't think one can really anticipate this erroneous structure of the organization entering a new novel milieu by constantly going back and incorporating what one knows in what one knew before. I think there has to be this erroneous, just eruption of reductive meaning.
No, I get your point, but I'm just kind of trying to figure out. Yeah, maybe we leave this be and shift the focus to something else. If somebody else had like other things that you found interesting, maybe we can focus on that. Otherwise, we'll just go in circles more or less. We've exhausted this one like completely half an hour ago.
I just wanted to say on the topic of when you said this free improvisation in music as if it's some discovery of constantly new things. I don't think it's actually the case, but, and I think
let
it's actually
music be, man.
No, I think it's fascinating because in a setting like that where everyone is improvising, and you think it's improvised, but actually very quickly a certain normativity emerges. Like you put these people together and they use these different sounds from their imagination or whatever, but you very quickly have to start to cooperate with others and you try to find some kind of sense in what you're doing musically. So normativity emerges very quickly, and I'm very much doubtful whether anything really drastically new can emerge in a setting like that. I know like jazz musicians pride themselves in being able to improvise very much, but if you analyze it closely, it's very much a reuse of patterns they've accumulated through their musical training, and there's not all that much radically new discoveries, complete changes. It's really just like very fine differences, perhaps at most.
But I would agree. But actually, in a way, so this free improvisation movement actually makes the exact point. In jazz, you don't really have pure improvisation. And this pure improvisation is not just that anything new emerges. You're still kind of within the technique of adapting yourself to instruments, of communicating with others. The problem is just that this kind of way of understanding novelty changes, because it's not that you'd like to change. It's not like you before you go on stage, like it's actually normal to do in normal performances. You check all the ways, you kind of imagine all the ways you want to develop it, all the themes and all the expressive elements. That's and of course then on the stage it's this moment and new things arise and you have to incorporate them and transform what you previously thought, of course. So there's this actual virtual element, right? But the point is actually that what free improvisation tries to do is to say, yeah, we have these techniques, we have these cliches. This is exactly what they say. We have these techniques and we have these cliches. But the point is that by letting them just kind of, in a sense, be noise, we can discover novel approaches which wouldn't be possible if we tried to think about in which ways certain things could be developed, right? The ways of developing established meanings are achieved by this hermeneutic circle, right? When every step kind of discloses certain ways of developing meaning, and then you grab some and you incorporate them, you know something more about it. No, it's something radically new. There's certain nonsense here, like this way of disclosing the horizon, if we use the Gadamerian terms, is not there, right? You have this interruption of nonsense, and this interruption of nonsense is what transforms the structure with which you were playing. And this is something completely different from when you try to adapt to situations, because then you can, because this adaptation is kind of linear. You produce steps, and you can deduce each step, not the direction of each step you can deduce from the previous step. But when you have this error present, the thought that enables this error is not linear. Yeah. Like the steps that you take are in a sense completely unpredictable, though they of course originate from this structure that you are operating with. And then when you arrive at the end, or even if you stop in the middle, you can say, aha, okay, this was the linear progression of my steps. But the problem is that hermeneutic approach would consider this even from the act of acting, the transition of steps would be linear. But when you improvise only backwards, the linear, only, yeah, retrogradno, the meaning appears, the linear structure appears. So that's the point that I'm also trying to do, to point out in vital phenomena. But yeah, let's shift to something else maybe.
I finally understand what you were saying, but I agree, but I'm not sure if this is possible. It seems to me that if you want to experience this sort of rupture, that would be this sort of new element that would not be a part of the old hermeneutic circle, you know, but of a new one that you cannot yet see, and that you don't have the picture of the whole, that in order to do that, you would simply you couldn't be you, because, and I think this is, I'm not sure if it's possible. I hope I understand you.
I don't know how to do it. Really, I can't do it. But when you look at people that can, it's unbelievable what they're. Also, when you talk with them, it's unbelievable. They're describing their experience as really mystical experience. So my brother, he's really into your book, Sebastjan, but he's really into mysticism as as a way to describe this experience. So kind of you're never yourself. That's exactly right. You're always in this you approach something completely other than yourself, and that's what's so wonderful in this experience. And it's really wonderful when you can do that. But yeah, I'm a philosopher. I pause too much, and that's the reason I always fall into cliches. But when you hear somebody that's really doing it, it's sure they can fail miserably. Sometimes he fails miserably, but sometimes it's really like it's almost a religious experience when you listen to this.
I think that basically one of the questions that remains, and it's really, I think that this is something we're kind of circling around, is the question of to what degree this is like contingent, you know, to what degree is this open in the sense of being able to just produce forms that are utterly and completely different. And if this is and if this is somehow true, then what kind of a narrative can you basically develop about any of this? It would seem that, you know, I'm not necessarily opposed to this per se, but it is, you know, a bit of a, I think that many people will not be willing to buy it if you simply say, you know, well, there's this intrusion of a certain something that forces you to undergo a transformation, and you cannot basically say anything whatsoever about this transformation in advance, set in advance, because it's a qualitative shift of sorts. And yeah, that basically is Mr. Scientist pack your bags and go home. I mean, sure, you can, of course, you're going to be able to introduce like interesting novel approaches and technologies and new models. But at the end of the day, Isaac, after 200 years, these will be completely irrelevant. So even if these intrusions occur and then enable you, when you have like these ruptures that you're saying, and then you have interventions of scientists providing new theories that then enable you to grasp a certain something in a different way, you know, it just seems, well, your story seems so contingent in a certain sense that it's a bit too contingent for my taste. You know, that there is a certain appeal to it, definitely. And again, I wouldn't be opposed to this idea of intrusion of a novelty and restructuration that is basically a transformation. But I just wonder, you know, is there a specific limit to it? Because you are a living being, and as a living being, usually there are certain criteria that you can fulfill in different ways and maybe in almost innumerable ways. But there are ways and structural conditions, such as, I don't know, you know, food and something like that, you know. And if you go as deep as possible, are you able to acquire like a specific set of primordial conditions that, I don't know, I'm just curious, you know, how contingent do we go here?
But this going deep is problematic already, because it's not just like you uncover. Merleau-Ponty does a little bit of this, but I think it's not just like uncovering different ways of structuring meaning. I actually think that these structures emerge because that's a very STS point, no, but you first have to measure things and then you can talk about them, right? And what fascinates me is that I'm kind of reading some stuff with my scientist friends who study science, and then there's this really brilliant physicist, and we were reading like a philosophy of mathematics, right? And he was like, he's like, come on, this is stupid, this is really, this is nothing, like why would I read this? And then after a while we switched to, and now we read an analysis of trust in physics, and he was so hyped. Really, this kind of complete contingent social way of interpreting science was for him the best theoretical explanation he could ever get about what he really does. The same with my other friends. There seems to be something so weird about philosophy of science because it doesn't appeal to like everyday scientists. But this STS, which seems to us like what I agree are like philosophically weird, seem to appeal to scientists like all the way. Really, this is a weird phenomenon. I really don't. You could say that they really know what science is about, but I don't know if that's a coherent point.
Yeah, but what you could say is basically, you know, the point that a phenomenologist, for example, would make is they like it because they like a certain way of approaching phenomena, and you have a similar way of doing it in, say, a natural science and in STS, which still tries to kind of provide an explanation, but using different parameters for doing so. So they're not really leaving their habitat. They're just switching the parameters and introducing new players, and they find it interesting and fascinating for that reason. Whereas if you introduce a philosophical account, what happens is usually you're kind of forced to abandon certain ways of thinking about phenomena and approaching them and actually, yes, even seeing them. And this is why many of them would be like, you know, what is this? It's just, you know, it's sheer bosh, or this is just, I don't get it. Why would you bother with this? STS is very palatable to them. It's just taking similar models, projecting them into the social realm. This is why I find it so, I don't know, do you people know what, do most of you know what STS is? Okay. STS is this, what is it? Science and technology studies, right? It's an offshoot of this anthropological / sociological approach to science. Some sort of it is usually deeply rooted in social constructivism of some sort. And the thing is, they usually think of themselves as being very, very different from natural scientists, because natural scientists, they, are determinists and whatnot. But basically, they're methodologically and epistemologically very, very similar. They're just, put a minus sign where the scientists put a plus sign, and vice versa. So, if it's a natural phenomenon, you just say, no, it's socially constructed phenomenon. It's not like that. But basically, the way the social construction works is very similar to how the natural world works. So, of course, they find it fascinating. It doesn't really require a lot of, I wouldn't say intellectual effort. That's not fair. But it's more like it doesn't really require of you to undergo a specific mode of transforming the way you think and see. You can still retain similar ways of looking at things. So I would say that this is the reason why some scientists find this so appealing. Even though if they thought this through, they would see that they can't have it both ways, ultimately. They would have to decide, because it's like,
I'm actually not sure, because the more I talk with this friend who, okay, he's probably going to do a PhD in Berkeley, and he's doing some simulation of the universe on the supercomputer. So he's really a genius, basically. But so he knows what it is about. And basically, when I talk to him, it becomes more and more clear. Then, of course, when a scientist acts in a social setting. So, for example, communicating with the Ministry of Science to get some funding, and interacting with philosophers also. One is, of course, going to pose like, I know everything, I have the keys to the universe. But when he's going to be in his natural setting, he's going to act completely different. Like, he's not going to say, I have the keys to the universe, because everybody was just like, okay, he's mad. He's going to like, for this specific problem, I'm proposing this methodological or theoretical conclusion or solution, right? And this is very contingent. Like, they're not trying to discover some underlying meaning, like Husserl, Heidegger would say. That's what I think. It's completely weird what phenomenology does of science. Like, science does not mathematize, because it's not everything sketched in advance as Heidegger would have it with techniques, right? There's this science operates as if it doesn't, socially it operates as it does, as if it did know something, but in its natural environment, it really, everything all the tools that philosophers approach science with, in order to explain the phenomena, for example, for political application, break down, I think. At least when I communicate with Jakob.
I would be very careful in this. I already made this point. Two things here. One, when you talk about with an average scientist, like especially those that are averse to any type of philosophizing, they will provide the image and the picture that usually gets attacked from the philosophical perspective. And when you read the textbook, this gets perpetuated. And when your friend writes a grant, he will use this narrative. And when he will deliver a lecture on YouTube, he will deliver this in the context of this particular narrative. So true, it operates on many different levels, but I wouldn't discard it, because it is this image that gets embedded in society. It is incorporated into the educational system, and it is the way that we perceive what science is doing, and this has a specific pool. So it has a very, very specific pool on how you view the world, how you understand it, what the appropriate methods are of approaching it and understanding it and explaining it. So I would be very careful here. It's one thing to say, yeah, it's a messy endeavor, and you have these models.
Then this is not an epistemological problem, it's a social problem. It's a problem which I think STS is trying to achieve, solve, that scientists should be able to talk to normal people in these uncertain terms without losing credibility. I think that's one of the main tasks of that STS gives itself, not to kind of enable scientists to talk in their natural way also in other situations. because in a sense, yeah, what you described is not really epistemological philosophical problem for me. It's a sociological.
Well, it depends on how you construe epistemology. You now seem to, you either have this, hardcore sociological approach or some pure sheer epistemology that's somewhere in the realms of. So, I think that this is a false problem. As soon as you pose it that way, you kind of miss the whole intermediary part. And this is where STS cashes in. And I have issues with that. Because, for example, what STS is producing is also like a ton of garbage. They're studying, you have, we've been focusing on these people who are really prominent scientists. We also have to study the networks of people who have contributed to this. And then, you have like the study of technicians or whatnot. And this is like, yeah, it's interesting. But on the other hand, it can become very banal and very trite and very trivial very quickly. So as soon as you get to this level, you have other problems that are also very pernicious. I think that what SDS is doing is some sort of a mirror of sorts. And it pointed out that, there are certain preconceptions about epistemology that are somewhat naive and that have been defended with force because the academic philosophers managed to do this and that this is problematic. But then they try to kind of pull it into another direction because they don't really have a good philosophical background or a core that would enable them to get out of a simply sociologizing. They're doing their best, but I don't think they're successful because they're basically adding plus where natural science has minus and vice versa. So in my opinion, STS is theoretically, philosophically way too short in many regards.
But I mean, at least I would probably agree that it's philosophically naive. Especially like the STS history of biology. To me, it's fascinating how Reinberger does the analysis of history of molecular biology. That's also the holistic thrust that I'm proposing that is necessary. But at the same time, I find this like he has to talk about what life is. That's an important question. But I don't think we can answer it by just philosophizing about it. We have to incorporate what STS is doing in a philosophical, but I'm really not sure how exactly to achieve that, because I'm also not for complete, that there's this complete and utter, that there's this big role, complete chance plays that eclipses everything else that's important. For me, one of the most important steps is when everything is developed, now synthesize everything, like in autopoiesis or systemic approaches but even systemic approaches, they don't really do the autopoietic thing. They're still, in this sense, naive. And so I think there is a necessary and irreducible duality here that should not be ignored. And I think Goldstein actually doesn't ignore it. And this view of viewing organism completely changed my reading of Goldstein, right? It's not really what he says. He senses something really important, but doesn't really have the tools to explicate it, yeah.
What I think you're proposing here is that like a very strict distinction between analysis and synthesis. Like what we were talking before, like, so you have like, it seems to me like you conceive a scientist's work like gathering data, like some kind of raw data, out of which the philosopher kind of proposes a unified picture. Is this unfair, or Isaac, or wrong?
I wouldn't say so much gathering data as constructing technologies with which one can interact with the chosen sphere of being. So that's, yeah, which is different from just gathering data, right? It's much more about construction of technical environments in which, for example, organisms can reorganize themselves or be introduced to certain cures like genetic editing, which disrupt their organizational capabilities. So in a sense, you're right. I'm proposing too much of a dualistic picture, but on the other hand, I would ask you to pull a Goldstein on me and just Yeah, I don't know really.
No, because
it's
I'm
too much
just trying to.
It's too dualistic. Yeah.
No, sorry, I'm just trying to get at the root of the problem because I don't see one. I mean, I have trouble seeing the problem here between you and Sebastjan. Like, okay, so I think we all want to avoid this kind of a strict distinction between, I mean, it seems nonsensical to me to pose it in those terms, and a very classical solution at that. I mean, but what I would, I mean, I would of course totally agree that you have contingencies which disrupt your body of knowledge, and you have to respond to that. And you could call that science, like systematic searching for those kinds of relevant contingencies, right? But on the other hand, if this is, I mean, this could be called experimental science, but that is nothing without theoretical science, which writes the key of what the relevant disturbances are. And here I see no distinction between philosophizing and doing science. At least for me, this is a non-problem.
But theoretical science doesn't just construct ultimate theories. Like it constructs multiple versions of theories. And even these theories are, I would say, contingent on the, I really excuse myself, but on the way one writes them down, the diagrams one uses. And here once more, the contingent element comes in, right? The contingent element of not completely understanding what you're writing, that the diagram is not completely transparent. You have to understand it, but you write it in order to understand it. And this understanding is not just one-way process, as the theoretical interpretation would already be constructed, right? You construct it by trying to understand it. And that's in a way similar to the experimental approaches, because this sedimentation of words which acquire a certain, so what's the opposite of transparency?
Opaqueness.
Opaqueness, yeah, that they are opaque in a certain way. Like there's this yeah, that you don't really understand what you're thinking about. That's what to me it's beautiful about the mathematics, right? I don't know if I mentioned this before, in what way who was it? Planck discovered that all energy is compartmentalized. So it comes in packages, right? Energy is not continuous. Basically, he just played with some established equations that describe the data. And then he came at an equation that's kind of described both equations, which were themselves incompatible. And then he had to think for some time before he really realized, oh, there's this presupposition here in the symbolic interpretation that energy is actually not continuous. That you have the kind of the smaller wave, the smallest wavelength that an electromagnetic energy can occupy. And this is also this element of chance, right? You have to just play with the symbols, and then something novel emerges, something radically novel.
Still, you know, the thing is, I see. So what you're writing this wave. It kind of is a long reaction to this, let's say, enlightenment view of what a human being is and what he's capable of and what's not. And I get it, you know, like, but the thing is that the way the direction in which you're pushing it makes everything so contingent that basically both life itself and human being is just, it looks like a complete idiocy at times. It's just like you have to write the diagram to see it, but you don't really see it. And then, you know, I think that the aspect that you're trying to underline, and that's really important, you're taking it so far that you really do lose any type of narrative. You end up in some sort of a Derridarianism of sorts. Like, okay, it's cool. It sounds cool. If you're going to write a book, people will probably read it and, you know, be fascinated by it. But at the end of the day, it's just, you know, there's a certain impotence in this deconstructive approach, and it runs out fairly quickly. After a while, it just gets exhausted, and you don't really know what to do with it. I think that there is a specific merit to having emphasized these intrusions and whatnot. But if you don't really have a certain story that you can weave around them, that is in some sort of a positive account, it just starts running on empty, so to speak. And I think this is what I get from you. You get so fascinated with lacunae and breakdowns and everything that after a while, you don't really have a lot to say. Aside from showing, well, but this is where it breaks. This is where you cannot say what's going to happen. This is where the transformation happens. You do this, you don't really know it. You have to do it before you can understand it. And even when you understand it, it's a social context. So you kind of end up in some sort of it is a position that is also quite popular nowadays. It's in the air somehow. I don't see it as particularly appealing as a grand scheme of everything. So my point would be, unless you're able to somehow pin it down, it will run on empty.
Yeah,
one problem, if I may, I have a slight difficulty for like the past half an hour following what problem are we actually approaching and dealing with here. I don't see the guiding question of this discussion.
That
if
I don't
someone
have a
can
positive
summarize.
account. That I don't have a positive account, I think. And I think, sure, this is a problem, but at least this is heavily tied to my practice as a cello player, because when I thought about gestures in a, one could say, Merleau-Pontian way, I very often found myself in rigid situations. So I would say that there's something very important, especially in late Merleau-Ponty, which is basically early Derrida if you read it closely. I would say that. But there is sure, there is this meaning that you have to account for, that this positive creation of meaning. And I agree, just right now in my practice, and especially perhaps the way we talk about or vital phenomena, to me this seems like a valuable approach, not to undermine what we do, because it seems to me something extremely important, just to not ground to a halt, just focusing on explication of holistic phenomena, but also allow this interruption of error, or something like that could be my position. Because of course, as you said, if I don't have the narrative that I would perform this on, of course everything falls to pieces, right? Nothing. Sorry.
Now, can I ask you this? What would you say, would this position be applicable to a composer as well as a reproductive musician? Like, how would, I think there's a kind of mindset that, and I'm not criticizing, I mean, just, it seems to me that this kind of mindset applies very well to a musician that has material already composed for him. Would you say that, like, when you have to, when you are at the task of constructing something new, there's something missing in this deconstructive account? I mean,
here's where the problem of reification comes in. If you reify a thing, if you have to regulate its correctness, if you don't allow for error or whatever, then you lose this connection. You also get rigid, and that's what I think, that cliches and rigidities, they're not really so something objective in the sense that this is really rarefied, but it's something much more connected perhaps to the individual composer, that he really cannot write. He becomes like, he has the composer's block, I don't know. But I think this is still present, because when you account for I mean, the example of color, of tone color, is a good one, because you can say there has always been a certain, especially from, let's say, Rimsky-Korsakov on, you have this fascination with color, but it was never really taken up. It was always an accident, right? It seems nice and it's very nice, but it's always an accident. And then on a certain level, when you had this, when you already had the Impressionism, which does a lot with color, but not really systematically, then you arrive at Schoenberg, and he says, okay, let's do now things systematically. Like, let's
What
create.
I don't get is, why do you feel this need to, I don't know, kind of mystify this creative process, to take this intrusion and to ascribe so much meaning to it? I mean, like this intrusion, this emergence of novelty. I don't think that's necessary. I don't know, if I look at my own creative process. Yeah?
To me or Isaac? Is this addressed?
Isaac.
Oh.
Yeah, Isaac, like these intrusions. For example, in my own creative process, I don't know, if I'm writing some kind of lyrics, and I don't know, I guess for a while I'm struggling, and then suddenly I don't know, a phrase emerges in my mind. Like it's just a certain arrangement of thoughts. Why should I have to come up with this whole methodological, epistemological, metaphysical account of how novelty emerges and how these why should I talk about these intrusions on such a mystical level?
You know about the 4-chord phenomena? Like everybody writes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
6, 4, 5, something like that.
Yeah.
And basically, the idea behind is that, sure, you have very creative people that write in these ways with this scheme, but the problem is that if you write just, and this is actually my problem when I do improvisation. So it's actually, I struggle with this problem of introducing chance into my thinking. So that's one of the reasons I'm so interested in. Basically, you have to somehow be able to play what you don't like in order to establish this as something that is not simply a copy of something that has come before. Because this 4/4 chord progression is really is gaining influence, actually, because people are constantly listening to it. People they have a habitual affection for it, and then they write what seems to them to be nice, to be beautiful. But that's the wrong way, because you're always kind of, you always have this baggage behind yourself. And what I know from my contact with different people is that there's this element of weirdness. Like, even if the pointillism movement, Timmy, please correct me if I do say something stupid, but basically this idea, let's paint as we see, and we see in dots, you know. This is a complete stupid idea, actually, but it began a movement that was in a way very original. But the idea itself is like stupid almost. That there is this important chance that you don't just reproduce what you like, but you kind of come up with something that you don't know really, do you like or not, and then you kind of construct, you normalize it, Canguilhem would say. And that's what I would say against it.
What I'm just saying is that I don't think there's a need to make it more than it is. Like you've explained it in perfectly normal terms without any intrusions just now, and that's my whole problem. Like this I guess I should say Derrida angle of trying to deconstruct it in this kind of abstract level of intrusions, the writing of various cultural codes and everything. But like, why not just stay on this behavioral level, this cognitive level? Okay, so yeah, I'm trying to do something a little different. Let's try something that sounds wrong. Oh, look, a new combination just seemed to emerge, and that's it.
That's because Derrida for me describes in what way one can, if one is completely fixed in a philosophical system, in an interpretation of a novel, or in writing of a composition, of a song even, and one has this block. What is for me, and this is a very unorthodox reading of Derrida probably, but what's for me fascinating, that he develops a methodology by which you can, okay, so let's try this, maybe this will liberate you. Oh, let's try this, maybe this will liberate you. And in order to have this, the techniques of deconstructing, you have to have a certain theory of how to construct these techniques, right? You have to, and this of course is itself problematic from the Derrida point of view. But there is something important methodological about Gadamer, Derrida, which a lot of people, I think, miss. It's not about that third culture calls and everything. Yeah, sure. But I think there is a deeper meaning like this, because Merleau-Ponty does this in a similar way. So he says there's always this difference between me and the object, the chiasmatic difference, the transition that I feel is never immediate. Like there's this longing for feeling the other arm as the sensible and the other arm as the sensing. Yeah, there's this longing for a transition, and in this transition a novelty appears. But this is, to me, I mean, the starting point, sure, but it's just a little bit naive. It doesn't have this methodological the possibility of this wide application that I find in Derrida. So that's actually not so much that you speak theoretically about it because you want to develop new techniques of how to do it. Did I answer?
I guess we can. Yeah. I mean, we could discuss probably for a couple more hours on this, but it's kind of late, so I'm going to leave. I guess you can keep talking. I don't think it'll end the session if I leave.